Part of our challenge as Christians is dealing with the nature of systemic inequality, particularly with regard to food and how food is distributed and food security. Now, my inspiration for believing passionately that all should have access to decent and healthy food comes from my belief in the Eucharist, where we see God feeding us with his very self, where we are given those signs and tokens of the kingdom. Now, it's very difficult if you receive the sign and the token of the kingdom to continue to support systems that lead to systemic inequality.
The point of love in Christianity is always to be practical, not just theoretical. And as the Epistle to James so clearly states, there's no point in saying to somebody who's hungry, eat well, unless you give them some food. And in all cases where we're vulnerable people, we should be willing to sacrifice ourselves to help them to overcome their vulnerabilities, to satisfy their needs.
The context in which we interact with the most significant number of animals is in animal agriculture, the animals that we eat. And that industry also has phenomenal consequences for human beings. Animal agriculture, we know, is a massive driver of climate change. Increased flooding in Bangladesh, the expansion of desert in Africa in particular and in many other places. Human food supply is reduced because of the amount of food that we feed to animals.
We are in the 21st century and we have millions who still wake up with hungry bellies and millions who go to bed and close their eyes at night hungry is really quite shocking. And if there are ways through developments of use of our land for farming, for plant farming rather than animal farming, then it would seem strange not to explore that.
We could, without animal agriculture, free up land the equivalent of the land mass of Africa. We would need less than 25% of that to feed the whole population of the world. I find that statistic staggering. Yet, if we all only make quite small changes, we can make that a reality.
So I did this 30-day vegan pledge thing. I think it was with the Vegan Society, and the idea being that over the course of 30 days you make these kind of adaptations. As you run out of something, replace it with a vegan alternative. A couple of weeks into that, they started to talk about the way that agriculture uses land and how land is kind of, I guess, used more for the benefit of Western diets because of the weight that we give to meat in our diets, and actually that's taking land away from communities that may actually need that to grow crops for their own food, and how the use of land has been diverted and the impact of that. And I think that was kind of the final thing for me, the final decider. And so when it connected to the harm of humans and communities, I think that's when it really kind of gripped me. And I think from that point then, I have now got other reasons that sustain my veganism that are much more animal focused. But I think the initial thing was around climate and around human communities and human life and how those are so interconnected, really.
To work in a slaughterhouse is something I can't imagine. yet we demand that other people do it for the sake of our palate preferences. It's badly paid work. It's work that often immigrant communities are driven to. Concern for fellow human beings ought also to be driving us away from seeing animals as part of our food supply.
It's noticeable that animal rights organisations can film in factory farms bad practices, but that's not surprising because it does brutalise the people who are involved in that process of exploiting animals. If we're getting somebody to do that exploiting of other creatures on our behalf, then it brutalises the person we've delegated that responsibility to. Whether they're farming animals or whether they're culling animals and packaging animals.
So if I am paying for my eggs or my meat, I am paying for the violence and supporting the cruelty that goes on in those places, which does destroy people as well as murder animals. And we know that slaughterhouse workers don't last very long, often are only working there because they can't get anything else, receive no backup or support for the trauma they experience.
Even if we can't evolve our consciences around animals, at the very least we should have a conscience about our fellow human beings, and they are suffering mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually as a result of our obsession with eating meat.
I believe that the decision to stop consuming any animal products of any form is a expression of love not only towards animals, but to all poor people everywhere.
We are turning our backs on the violence and the cruelty inherent in the meat industry. We're rejoicing in the natural gifts that God has given us through plants and grains and the like. And we're helping to repair a damaged planet.
When Jesus comes to bring liberation, he comes to bring healing, he comes to bring peace, he comes to set the world aright with God. And part of our role is to promote that healing, that wholeness, that fullness of being, which I believe comes through treating the environment well, treating one another well, and appreciating that Jesus' sacrifice made once and once for only on the cross gives us an example of how we are called to bring the maximum amount of fullness of life to the maximum amount of beings.